Chapter 48, Covering Mud with Straw. Venerable Moggallana suggested a meeting take place between the Buddha's senior disciples at Jetavana and the principal instigators of the Kosambi conflict. The goal of the meeting was to learn from the experience in order to come up with ways to prevent such conflicts from taking place again. Venerable Mahakassapa presided over the meeting. To begin the meeting, Mahakassapa asked Anuruddha to repeat the 6 principles of harmonious living that the Buddha had expounded during his stay at Eastern Bamboo Forest. After hearing Anuruddha explain the 6 principles, Moggallana suggested that the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis in all monastic centers be asked to memorize them. After 4 days of discussion, the bhikkhus in the meeting formulated 7 practices of reconciliation to be used to settle the dispute within the Sangha. They named these 7 methods Saptahikirana Samatha. The first practice is Sammukha Vinaya, or face-to-face sitting. According to this practice, the dispute must be stated before the entire convocation of bhikkhus, with both sides of the conflict present. This is to avoid private conversations about the conflict, which inevitably influence people against one side or the other, creating further discord and tension. The second practice is Smrti Vinaya, or remembrance. In the convocation, both parties involved try to remember from the beginning everything that led up to the conflict. Details should be presented with as much clarity as possible. Witnesses and evidence should be provided, if available. The community listens quietly and patiently to both sides in order to obtain adequate information to examine the dispute. The third practice is Amutta Vinaya, or non-stubbornness. The monks in question are expected to resolve the conflict. The community expects both parties to demonstrate their willingness to reach reconciliation. Stubbornness is to be considered negative and counterproductive. In case a party claims he violated a precept because of ignorance or an unsettled state of mind, without actually intending to violate it, the community should take that into account in order to find a solution that is agreeable to both sides. The fourth practice is Tetsvabhayasya Vinaya, or voluntary confession. Each party is encouraged to admit his own transgressions and shortcomings without having to be prodded by the other party or the community. The community should allow each party ample time to confess its own failings, no matter how minor they may seem. Admitting one's own faults begins a process of reconciliation and encourages the other party to do likewise. This leads to the possibility of full reconciliation. The fifth practice is Pratikaraka Vinaya, or accepting the verdict. When the verdict is reached, Japtika Tortin Kamavakana will be read aloud 3 times. If no one in the community voices disagreement with it, it is considered final. Neither party in dispute has the right to challenge the verdict. They have agreed to place their trust in the community's decision and carry out whatever verdict the community reaches. The sixth practice is Yabhayuskiya Vinaya, or decision by consensus. After hearing both sides and being assured of the wholehearted efforts by both sides to reach a settlement, the community reaches a verdict by consensus. The seventh practice is Trinataraka Vinaya, or covering mud with straw. During the convocation, a venerable elder monk is appointed to represent each side in the conflict. These are high monks who are deeply respected and listened to by others in the Sangha. They sit and listen intently, saying little. But when they do speak, their words carry special weight. Their words have the capacity to soothe and heal wounds, to call forth reconciliation and forgiveness, just as straw covers mud, enabling someone to cross it without dirtying his clothes. Thanks to the presence of these elder bhikkhus, the disputing parties find it easier to release petty concerns. Bitterness is eased, and the community is able to reach a verdict agreeable to both sides. The Buddha's senior disciples submitted the 7 practices of reconciliation for his approval. He praised their work and agreed that the practices should become part of the formal precepts. The Buddha remained at Jetavana for 6 months before returning to Rajagaha. He stopped to visit the Bodhi tree on the way and entered Uruvela to visit Svasti's family. Svati was 21 years old. The Buddha had returned to fulfill his promise to welcome Svasti into the Sangha when he was old enough. Svati was ordained and fast became Rahula's closest friend. Chapter 49. Earth's Lessons. Svasti listened with great interest to all that Assaji and Ananda recounted about the Buddha's efforts to spread the Dharma. Bhikkhuni Gautami and Rahula listened intently too. Ananda's memory was truly phenomenal. He filled in many details that Assaji forgot to mention. Svasti was grateful to both bhikkhus and to Bhikkhuni Gautami and novice Rahula. Thanks to them, he learned much about the Buddha's life. He could never have learned otherwise. Svasti hoped that he would always be able to live close by the Buddha in order to witness his life and receive his teachings directly. Thanks to Sujati, even though Svasti was an untouchable buffalo boy, he'd learned the basics of a young man's education. But his lessons with her had ended several years ago, when she left Uruvela to marry a man in the village of Nadika. Svasti knew that he could learn a great deal from Rahula. He found Rahula's bearing full of gentle dignity. Not only was Rahula from a noble caste, but he had spent the past 8 years living in the serene and concentrated atmosphere of the Sangha. Compared to Rahula, Svasti felt rough and awkward, but his feelings caused him to devote great efforts to his practice. Sariputta asked Rahula to show Svasti basic practices such as putting on the robe, holding the begging bowl, walking, standing, lying down, sitting, eating, washing, listening to Dharma talks, all in mindfulness. A bhikkhu memorized and paid diligent attention to 45 practices, all of which helped to deepen his focus and serenity. In principle, Rahula was still only a novice, a samanera. He had to wait until he was 21 years old to take full vows. A samanera had 10 precepts: do not kill, do not steal, do not engage in sexual relations, do not speak falsehoods, do not drink alcohol, do not wear jewelry, flowers, or perfume, do not sit or lie down on any wide, high, or fancy bed, do not participate in secular dancing and singing parties, do not handle money, and do not eat past the noon hour. The 45 practices were followed by ordained bhikkhus, but Rahula was expected to study and observe them in preparation for his full vows. A bhikkhu observed 120 precepts, which included the 45 practices. Rahula told Svasti that additional precepts would probably be added, and that he had heard they might well number 200 or more in time. Rahula explained to Svasti that in the first years of the Sangha there were no precepts. Ordination was simple. A person had only to kneel at the feet of the Buddha or another bhikkhu and recite the 3 refuges 3 times. It became necessary to create and enforce precepts as the Sangha grew, because in so large a community there were bhikkhus who needed rules and guidelines in order to better discipline themselves. Rahula told Svasti that the first person to violate the spirit of the Sangha was a bhikkhu named Sudina. It was because of Sudina that the Buddha created the first precepts. Before he was ordained, Sudina was married and lived in the village Kalanda on the outskirts of Vasali. When he heard the Buddha teach, he asked to be ordained. Shortly after that, he had a chance to return to Kalanda. His family invited him for a meal in their home, and he consented. His family implored him to return to secular life and help run the family business. He refused. His parents complained because Sudina was their only child and they had no one to inherit the business. They feared that the family's wealth would fall into someone else's hands. Seeing Sudana's determination to remain a bhikkhu, his mother suggested that the least he could do was to leave a child as an heir. Persuaded by his mother's pleas and without precepts to guide him, he agreed to meet with his former wife in Mahavana forest. His wife conceived and gave birth to a boy. They named Bijaka, which means seed. Sudana's friends taunted him by calling him Seed's father. The reputation of the Sangha was tarnished. The Buddha called the bhikkhus together and chastised Sudina. Because of this incident, formal precepts were instituted. It was decided that whenever a bhikkhu violated the spirit of the way of enlightenment and liberation, a convocation will be called and a new precept added. The precepts were called Patimokkha. 4 precepts were considered cardinal. The violation of any one of these 4 resulted in being expelled from the community. All the other precepts could be forgiven by making confession. The 4 cardinal precepts were: do not engage in sexual relations, do not steal, do not kill, and do not claim to have attained insight you have not actually attained. These 4 precepts were called parajika. Rahula also told Svasti that the Buddha had never treated him with special favors, even though his father dearly loved him. He recalled how at the age of 11 he told a fib to Sariputta because he was afraid of being scolded for running off and playing when he had other duties. He ended up having to tell 4 fibs in a row for fear that Sariputta would uncover the truth. But as is almost always the case, the truth came out. The Buddha used this occasion to teach Rahula how important it was always to tell the truth. At that time, Sariputta and Rahula dwelled in Ambatika Park, not far from Bamboo Forest where the Buddha was staying. One day the Buddha paid them a visit. Rahula set out a chair for him and brought him a basin of water to wash his hands and feet. When the Buddha was finished washing, he poured out most of the water in the basin. He looked at Rahula and asked, "Rahula, is there a little or a lot of water in this basin?" Rahula answered, "There is very little left." The Buddha said, "You should know, Rahula, that a person who does not tell the truth has a little dignity left as the water in this basin." Rahula was silent. The Buddha poured out the remaining water and asked his son, "Rahula, do you see how I have emptied all the water out?" "Yes, I see." Those who continue to tell untruths lose all their integrity, just as this basin has lost all its water. The Buddha turned the basin upside down and asked Rahula, "Do you see how this basin is turned upside down?" "Yes, I see." If we don't practice correct speech, our integrity is turned upside down, just like this basin. Don't tell fibs, even in jest, Rahula. Do you know why one uses a mirror? Yes, a mirror is used to look at one's reflection. Just so. Regard your own actions, thoughts, and words just as a person looks into a mirror. Rahula's story made Svasti more deeply aware of the importance of right speech. He could recall times he had fibbed to his parents, and even once to Sujata. He was thankful he had never lied to the Buddha. Actually, it seemed impossible to lie to the Buddha. Even if someone did, the Buddha would surely be able to tell. Svasti thought to himself, "I will resolve always to speak the truth to everyone I meet, even the smallest child. This will be the way I can show my gratitude to the Buddha for all he has done for me. I will observe the precepts diligently." Twice a month, on new moon and full moon days, the bhikkhus gathered to recite the precepts. Each precept was read aloud, and then the community was asked if anyone had failed to keep that precept. If no one spoke, the next precept was read. If someone had violated the precept, he stood and made a confession to the community. With the exception of the 4 parajika, confession was enough to make amends. On many days, Svasti was asked to join the Buddha's group for begging, joined by Sariputta and Rahula. That retreat season, they dwelled in the hills near the town of Ekanala, south of Rajaka. One afternoon, as the bhikkhus passed by rice fields near Ekanala, they were stopped by a wealthy farmer from a noble caste named Bharavaja. He owned several thousand acres. It was the season for ploughing, and he was out directing the efforts of hundreds of labourers. When he saw the Buddha pass by, he stood directly in his way and said with some contempt, "We are farmers. We plough, sow seeds, fertilize, tend, and harvest crops in order to eat. You do nothing. You produce nothing, yet you still eat. You're useless. You don't plough, sow, fertilize, tend, or harvest." The Buddha responded, "Oh, but we do. We plough, sow, fertilize, tend, and harvest." "Then where are your ploughs, your buffaloes, and your seeds? What crops do you tend? What crops do you harvest?" The Buddha answered, "We sow the seeds of faith in the earth of a true heart. Our plough is mindfulness, and our buffalo is diligent practice. Our harvest is love and understanding. Sir, without faith, understanding, and love, life would be nothing but suffering." Bharavaja found himself unexpectedly moved by the Buddha's words. He asked an attendant to bring the Buddha fragrant rice simmered in milk, but the Buddha refused by saying, "I have not shared these things with you in order to be given food. If you would like to make an offering, please do so at another time." The landowner was so impressed by this that he prostrated himself before the Buddha and asked to be accepted as a lay disciple. Svasti witnessed this take place firsthand. He understood how much he could learn by remaining close to the Buddha's side. He knew that of several thousand bhikkhus in the Buddha's Sangha, few had the good fortune to be as close to the Buddha as he himself was. After the retreat season, the Buddha travelled northwards to spread the Dharma. He returned to Savatthi at the end of autumn. One morning when they were out begging, Rahula strayed from mindfulness. Although he continued to walk in file, his mind was elsewhere. He gazed at the Buddha ahead of him and wondered what the Buddha would have become if he had not followed the spiritual path. If he had become a mighty emperor, what would Rahula himself be now? Thinking such thoughts, Rahula forgot to observe his breathing and steps. Even though the Buddha could not see Rahula, he knew his son had lost his mindfulness. The Buddha stopped and turned around. The other bhikkhus came to a halt. The Buddha looked at Rahula and said, "Rahula, are you observing your breath and maintaining mindfulness?" Rahula lowered his head. The Buddha said, "To dwell in mindfulness, you must continue to observe your breath. We practice meditation even as we beg. Continue to meditate on the impermanent and non-self nature of the aggregates which comprise all beings. The 5 aggregates are the body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Observe your breath and thoughts, and your mind will not become dispersed." The Buddha turned back around and continued to walk. His words served as a reminder to all the bhikkhus to maintain their mindfulness. But a few steps after that, Rahula abandoned the line of bhikkhus and entered the forest, where he sat alone beneath a tree. Svasti followed him, but Rahula looked up at him and said, "Please go begging with the others. I don't have the heart to go begging right now. The Buddha corrected me before the entire community. I feel so ashamed. I'd rather sit here alone and meditate." Seeing he was unable to help his friend, Svasti rejoined the other bhikkhus. On the walk back to the monastery, Venerable Sariputta and Svasti stopped in the forest to invite Rahula to walk back with them. At the monastery, Svasti shared half of his food with Rahula, and when they had finished eating, Sariputta told Rahula that the Buddha wished to see him. Svasti was permitted to accompany him. The Buddha understood that Rahula was ripe to receive certain teachings. He said, "Rahula, learn from the earth. whether people spread pure and fragrant flowers, perfume or fresh milk on it, or discard filthy and foul-smelling feces, urine, blood, mucus and spit on it, the earth receives it all equally, without clinging or aversion. When pleasant or unpleasant thoughts arise, don't let them entangle or enslave you. Learn from the water, Rahula. When people wash dirty things in it, the water is not sad or disdainful. Learn from fire. Fire burns all things without discrimination. It is not ashamed to burn impure substances. Learn from the air. The air carries all fragrances, whether sweet or foul. Rahula, practice loving kindness to overcome anger. Loving kindness has the capacity to bring happiness to others without demanding anything in return. Practice compassion to overcome cruelty. Compassion has the capacity to remove the sufferings of others without expecting anything in return. Practice sympathetic joy to overcome hatred. Sympathetic joy arises when one rejoices over the happiness of others and wishes others well-being and success. Practice non-attachment to overcome prejudice. Non-attachment is the way of looking at all things openly and equally. This is because that is because this is. Myself and other are not separate. Do not reject one thing only to chase after another. Rahula, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and non-attachment are beautiful and profound states of mind. I call them the four immeasurables. Practice them and you will become a refreshing source of vitality and happiness for others. Rahula, meditate on impermanence in order to break through the illusion of self. Meditate on the nature of the body's birth, development, and death in order to free yourself from desires. Practice observing your breath. Mindfulness of the breath brings great joy. Svasti was happy to be sitting next to Rahula, listening to all the Buddha had to say. Though Svasti had memorized sutras such as Turning the Wheel of Dharma and the nature of non-self, he felt that he'd never tasted the subtle flavor of the Dharma as deeply as today. Perhaps it was because he had not heard the other sutras spoken directly by the Buddha. The first sutra he had heard directly was the sutra on tending water buffaloes. But at that time he was not yet ripe enough to grasp many of its deeper meanings. He promised himself that during his free time he would recite all the sutras, using his newly gained insight. That day the Buddha also spent time teaching the two young men various methods of observing the breath. Though Svasti and Rahula had received similar instruction before, this was the first time they received it directly from the Buddha. The Buddha told them that the first fruit of mindfully observing the breath was overcoming dispersion and forgetfulness. Breathing in, you are aware that you are breathing in. Breathing out, you are aware that you are breathing out. During such moments of breathing practice, focus your mind on nothing but your breath. Useless and scattered thoughts will cease, allowing your mind to dwell in mindfulness. When you are aware of your breathing, you dwell in mindfulness. Dwelling in mindfulness, you cannot be led astray by any thoughts. With just one breath, you can attain awakening. That awakening is the Buddha nature that exists in all beings. Breathing in a short breath, you know that you are breathing in a short breath. Breathing out a long breath, you know that you are breathing out a long breath. Be totally aware of each breath. Mindfully observing your breathing will help you build concentration. With concentration, you will be able to look deeply into the nature of your body, feelings, mind, and the objects of mind, which are called savadharma. The Buddha had taught them wholeheartedly. His words were simple but profound. Svasti was confident that thanks to this special session with the Buddha, he would find it easier to maintain mindfulness of breathing and therefore would be able to make greater progress in his practice. After bowing to the Buddha, Svasti and Rahula walked to the lake together. They repeated to each other all the things the Buddha had taught them in order to remember them well.